Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Tuesday, 6 February 2024. It is the 112th anniversary of the birth of Christopher Hill, who was born in York on this date in 1912. Hill was an English Marxist historian at a time when we could say that there was something of a school of English Marxist historians. Chief among them, I would say, would be E.P. Thompson, who wrote The Making of the English Working Class. Thompson's book opens with what I consider a ham-handed discussion of class and class consciousness in the preface. And honestly, I'm surprised anyone bothered to continue reading on after this, but apparently they did. Also among these Marxist historians was Eric Hobsbawm, who died a multimillionaire, Rodney Hilton, George Rude, V.G. Kiernan, and A.L. Morton, among others. At the same time that these Marxist historians were active, there was a school of thought which we now call the British Scientific Marxists, sometimes also called the Red Scientists, which included J.D. Bernal, who was, by all accounts, a charismatic Stalinist who defended Lysenko. So in other words, he was a spineless party hack. There was J.B.S. Haldane, who actually spied for the Soviet Union, Conrad Waddington, Joseph Needham, and Lancelot Hogben, to name some of the most famous ones. So Marxism played a significant role in the intellectual life of England in the 20th century. We tend to think of Marxist domination of 20th century thought as primarily a continental thing, but we have to also include the Brits. The Marxist historians were often associated with the slogans history from below and history from the bottom up, which are also slogans of what we call social history. Social history was a reaction against traditional history with its focus on famous people, which was largely the result of the fact that there were records of famous people and there were far fewer records of people who were unknown and obscure. But the historical interest in famous personages went beyond merely records, and it reaches its, you could say it reaches its climax in something like Thomas Carlyle's great man theory of history. Social history reacts against this and attempts to relate the history of ordinary people in a given time period. With the British scientific Marxists, or I should say with the Marxist historians, this social history was pursued from a specifically Marxist angle, which means it was also frequently pursued jointly with economic history, but again, economic history written from a Marxist point of view. There were also dissenting voices. Gordon Leff, for one, took on Marxist historians in The Tyranny of Concepts, A Critique of Marxism, and the book I have recommended in a previous episode, History and Social Theory. So there were others who were not involved, but the Marxist historians had a significant influence on mid-20th century British history. Christopher Hill's history is not quite as openly ideological as E.P. Thompson's. We don't find tiresome expositions of class consciousness or historical materialism in Hill, but we do still have the essence of a Marxist point of view. With Marxist historiography, we have an explicit philosophy of history, historical materialism, applied to the actual practice of history. So Marxist historiography provides a template for the application of philosophy to some non-specifically philosophical activity. Whether or not the template anybody wants to follow is another question entirely, but we can see it as an example of applied philosophy, and that makes it interesting. As a commie, Hill liked to write about revolutions, and he shared this with, say, the archaeologist V. Gordon Childe, who was also a commie, and who phrased his conception of the origins of civilization in terms of the urban revolution. So once again, there's the focus on revolution. Hill chose a revolutionary period of English history as his focus, the 17th century, which one of his books called The Century of Revolution, 1603 to 1714. In the introduction to this book, we read, quote, "The transformation that took place in the 17th century is far more than merely a constitutional or political revolution, or a revolution in economics, religion, or taste. It embraces the whole of life. Two conceptions of civilization were in conflict. One took French absolutism for its model, the other the Dutch Republic. The object of this book is to try to understand the changes which set England on the path of parliamentary government, economic advance, and imperialist foreign policy, of religious toleration and scientific progress," unquote. So Hill called the 17th century a century of revolution. Clearly, it was a very turbulent period. In the book, this anthology, Divine Right and Democracy, which is edited by David Wootton, we find a lot of the pamphlet literature of the period, which is discussed extensively by Christopher Hill. Wootton, in his introduction to this collection, writes, quote, "The 17th century was England's century of revolution. The revolution of 1642 to 9 which culminated in the execution of the king and the declaration of republic, saw the formation of the first secular political party defending the inalienable rights of man, the Levelers. It gave rise to the first communist movement with a strategy for effective social action, the Diggers, and it led to the formulation of the first materialist theory of historical change in the writings of James Harrington," unquote. Wootton cites Hill's book, A Century of Revolution, and Lazlitt's book, The World We Lost, as contrasting views of the century. So if Hill represents the radical perspective, Lazlitt represents the traditionalist perspective. So Peter Lazlitt's book, The World We Have Lost, England Before the Industrial Age, includes this paragraph, quote, "Every relationship in our world, which can be seen to affect our economic life, is open to change, is expected indeed to change of itself, or if it does not, to be changed, made better by an omnicompetent authority. This makes for a less stable social world, though it is only one of the features of our society which impels us all in that direction. All industrial societies, we may suppose, are far less stable than their predecessors. They lack the extraordinarily cohesive influence which familiar relationships carry with them, that power of reconciling the frustrated and the discontented by emotional means. Social revolution, meaning an irreversible changing of the pattern of social relationships, never happened in traditional patriarchal pre-industrial human society. It was almost impossible to contemplate," unquote. So is revolution pervasive in the 17th century, or is it impossible to contemplate? We might also ask a number of related questions. Is a period of social instability always revolutionary? Is revolution always the outcome of social instability? Also, we have the question of the scope and scale of what we can meaningfully call a revolution that is so close to the problem of the scope and scale of what we can reasonably call a crisis, which I discussed in my episodes on Sorokin and Barbara Tuchman. So Hill calls it the century of revolution. We recall that Hugh Trevor Roper implicitly calls it a century of crisis in his paper, which I mentioned previously, The General Crisis of the 17th Century. England does seem to have been caught up in the general crisis of the 17th century. While England was experiencing its revolutions on the continent, the 30 Years' War was raging. Nevertheless, of early modern English history, Hill wrote, quote, "It was a powerful civilization, a great improvement for most people on what had gone before," unquote. I find that claim interesting, that early modern England represents a powerful civilization. We can contrast this with what Kenneth Clark, in his book Civilization, said of the previous century of English history. Quote, I suppose it is debatable how far Elizabethan England can be called civilized. Certainly, it does not provide a reproducible pattern of civilization as does, for example, 18th century France. It was brutal, unscrupulous, and disorderly, unquote. In the aspects of social life that Clarke had in mind, I don't think the 17th century differed much from the 16th century. It is almost what we could call like a Hobbesian state of nature in which life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, in the famous quote. Not necessarily all of those things, but it certainly shares in some of this character. The turbulence of the period reminds me of a famous line from a movie delivered by the character Harry Lime in Orson Welles' film The Third Man. Quote, "In Italy, for 30 years under the Borgias, they had warfare, terror, murder, and bloodshed, but they produced Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, and the Renaissance. In Switzerland, they had brotherly love, they had 500 years of democracy and peace. And what did they produce? The cuckoo clock," unquote. That was written by Graham Greene, of course, who wrote the novel, but it's associated with Welles, who made the film and who acted the part of Harry Lime. But a very famous quote that many will recognize. And there is a historical principle lurking in there that creativity can emerge in periods of times of great tumult. And that was something I discussed in the previous episode on Pitirim Sorokin, when he said that crises and calamities have both a destructive aspect and a creative aspect. And the 17th century in England also produced great things. In addition to being violent and turbulent, it was an inflection point for the scientific revolution. Interestingly, Hill took issue with the most famous English scientist of the time, who was, of course, Isaac Newton, whom Hill seemed to see as a symbol of everything that was wrong with the period. In The World Turned Upside Down, he writes, quote, "Sir Isaac's twisted, buttoned-up personality may help us to grasp what was wrong with the society which deified him. So may Dean Swift, the fiercest critic of the New World in which money ruled, whose excremental vision extended backwards to a golden age when gold and repression were alike unknown. This society, which on the surface appears so rational, so relaxed, might perhaps have been healthier if it had not been so tidy, if it had not pushed all its contradictions underground, out of sight, out of conscious mind," unquote. Here, Hill calls Stuart England tidy, which is not what we would expect, since we've just heard it described by other authors as a turbulent and difficult and unscrupulous period of time. But Hill wanted to contrast this, what we could call proto-bourgeois attitude toward Newton and of Newton. He wanted to contrast this to the ideas of the radicals and their vision for society, which is most fully laid out, I think, in The World Turned Upside Down, Radical Ideas During the English Revolution, which was the book that I found in a used bookstore, which made me aware of Christopher Hill and his work. So we find a summary of much of Hill's argument in early in the book. Quote, "There were, we may oversimplify, two revolutions in mid-17th century England. The one which succeeded established the sacred rights of property, abolition of feudal tenures, no arbitrary taxation, gave political power to the property, sovereignty of parliament and common law, abolition of prerogative courts, and removed all impediments to the triumph of the ideology of men of property, the Protestant ethic. There was, however, another revolution which never happened, though from time to time it threatened. This might have established communal property, a far wider democracy in political and legal institutions, might have disestablished the state church and rejected the Protestant ethic," unquote. This theme is continued pretty much throughout the book. Hill seems to always have intimations of a lost communist utopia that might have been, but which didn't happen. Again, another quote. "There have been moments when it seemed as though from the ferment of radical ideas, a culture might emerge which would be different both from the traditional aristocratic culture and from the bourgeois culture of the Protestant ethic which replaced it. We can discern shadows of what this counterculture might have been like, rejecting private property for communism, religion for a rationalistic and materialistic pantheism, the mechanical philosophy for dialectical science, asceticism for unashamed enjoyment of the good things of the flesh. It might have achieved unity through a federation of communities, each based on the fullest respect for the individual. Its ideal would have been economic self-sufficiency, not world trade or world domination, unquote. And we can see in that passage a lot of familiar utopian talking points that are still very much with us today in the 21st century. We hear these kind of things all the time. In a more strictly historiographical vein, Hill addresses the familiar question of how every generation rewrites history for itself, for its own purposes, and why it does so. From the same book, quote, "History has to be rewritten in every generation because although the past does not change, the present does. Each generation asks new questions of the past and finds new areas of sympathy as it relives different aspects of the experiences of its predecessors," unquote. I think Hill was trying to imaginatively relive the experiences of levelers, true levelers, diggers, seekers, ranters, Quakers, and the Muggletonians that he wrote about. They seem to promote a vision of English society that Hill believed exemplifies his ideals of Marxism. And these experiences certainly were ripe to be relived in the 20th century with its many Marxist revolutions. So you can say that imagination might have its flights of fancy, but it remains largely bounded by history. In Some Intellectual Consequences of the English Revolution, Hill wrote, quote, "Once the historical event has taken place, it appears inevitable. Alternatives recede. History is written by winners, especially the history of revolutions. It is nevertheless worth trying to penetrate imaginatively back to the time when options still seemed open," unquote. Other historians have made similar claims. I found a pretty explicit version of this, a formulation of this in Johan Huizinga, the Dutch historian, from a 1934 paper, The Idea of History. Quote, "The historian must always maintain toward his subject an indeterminist point of view. He must constantly put himself at a point in the past at which the known factors still seem to permit different outcomes. If he speaks of Salamis, then it must be as if the Persians might still win. If he speaks of the coup d'etat of Brumaire, then it must remain to be seen if Bonaparte will be ignominiously repulsed. Only by continually recognizing that possibilities are unlimited can the historian do justice to the fullness of life," unquote. What Hill and Huizinga are saying is that the historian has to perform a thought experiment, which imaginatively places them in past events when the future is not only unknown, but undetermined. And that is the way you understand the aspirations of the participants in history as genuine aspirations. And those participants in history could then not only believe in the rightness of their cause, but also believe in the ultimate triumph of their cause. I think it's pretty clear that Christopher Hill indulged in this thought experiment because he valued the contributions of these 17th century radicals and their utopian ideals. And he liked to imagine what the counterfactual history of what might have happened if they had been successful, or perhaps even just more successful than they were, if things had turned out differently. We could even say that these radicals voiced perennial ideas that appear again and again in history. And 300 years later, in the 20th century, when Hill was writing about it, those outcomes were quite different. So happy birthday, Christopher Hill, and thanks for listening.